A review. Florine stared at nothing in particular as she was whisked from Fielhammer to Harder on one of the Dark Dwarf's golem-powered trains. Her passenger car, as with everything else Dark Dwarf, was designed with practicality in mind while comfort was seemingly avoided. It was standing room only and built entirely from enchanted steel with emplacements for siege weaponry and arrow slits for the vehicle's armed guard. The train itself traveled a bit slower than a Soul-Eater-drawn vehicle on the highways of the Sorceress Kingdom, though the train was capable of hauling far, far more than even the most heavy-duty freight wagon produced by Lian's workshops. Her friend would have very much liked Kazanaar with all of its technological marvels. Lian would be a much better fit here than me. She was probably overthinking things, but the idea of holding a review with Lady Albedo made Florine wonder if she had accomplished anything of note. The Prime Minister was very much a results-oriented individual. No, rather than a results-oriented individual, she was a results-oriented perfectionist. There had been many cases where a member of the House of Lords or the guilds rushed things to please her and ended up with a scathing reprimand for their unsatisfactory results. Probably the only thing that saved people that got on Lady Albedo's bad side was her high degree of professional pride. Of course, this also meant that getting on her good side was no guarantee of a smooth relationship in future endeavors. In the culture of the northern human countries, where patronage and clientelism dictated the terms of every relationship in society, this resulted in quite the harrowing experience for those who went into a meeting with Lady Albedo thinking that they could conduct their business as usual. However, it wasn't as if she wasn't willing to participate in such a system. It was the fact that nearly everything that most people could bring to the table was utterly worthless in her eyes. Pedigree and prestige meant nothing. She was so beautiful that most sane people decided that she was beyond their reach. Connections with insignificant parties, which was pretty much everyone to Lady Albedo, were of no value. Material wealth held no personal allure, though she was more than happy to think about how she could tax it. Lian and Clara are probably going through a whole lot of that right now. While she hadn't heard anything about it yet, the representatives from the various interests in the Baharuth Empire should have already arrived at Castle Corlin for trade negotiations. Clara had invited Lady Albedo to attend as a guest to observe the proceedings, though Florine wasn't sure whether she would appear or not. She also wasn't sure what she would think of the traditional interplay between aristocrats, as the first time she had been exposed to it resulted in Count Facet being tossed headfirst through a gate to some unknown location, never to be seen again. A glowing crystal on the monitor at the front of the passenger car changed from blue to green. The dwarves around her checked over their belongings while the soldiers guarding the train renewed their vigilance. "Is Harder that dangerous?" Florine asked. "It's all sorts of dangerous," Velgarth answered. "Probably nothing you'd have to worry about, though." The train came to a stop and Florine waited as the soldiers disembarked to secure the surroundings. Out of one of the arrow slits, she could see them pushing away the dozens of hawkers who came to sell food and beverage to the passengers. "Harder's atmosphere is a bit different from Fielhammer," Florine said. "Just a bit?" Velgarth frowned. "I can only really make any sense of the commercial activity," Florine replied. "Everything here has a more chaotic feel to it. Not that I mind." She continued peering out of the arrow slits, trying to identify the various goods and services being offered. As she did, she noted that the soldiers didn't abuse their authority to requisition any goods from the locals. Most would scarcely believe it, especially considering the evil and ruthless leanings of the Dark Dwarves. Come to think of it, that part is just like the Sorceress Kingdom. When the shattered remnants of the royal army spread the news of Rhystis's devastating defeat at the Battle of Katza Plains, everyone prepared for the worst. There were only a few who didn't, such as Lian, who pointed out that there was no reason for the victors to follow proper legal procedures if all they wanted was to raze everything to the ground. Technically, she had been proven wrong as the new administration ended up leveling the paupers' quarter of Erantal, but, for the most part, Lian was right beyond even her own expectations. When their unfathomably evil new overlord occupied the territory, there was no looting, arson, or rape. In the subsequent weeks, violent and destructive crime fell to nothing. The Dark Dwarves were the second case demonstrating that being evil did not necessarily mean lawless, chaotic, or destructive. If anything, being perceived as evil probably made maintaining law and order easier, as would-be criminals and other disruptive elements did not doubt that those in power would be more than pleased to dish out some unspeakable punishment for even the lightest crimes. An officer re-entered the passenger car and gave them the all-clear. Once Florine and Velgarth disembarked, they were swiftly led through the milling crowds up a shallow incline leading away from the railway terminus. "How far is it to Harder Gate from here?" Florine asked. "About an hour at this rate," Velgarth answered. "There usually isn't such a large crowd up here." "We're still pushing the council forces out of Harder," the captain leading their escort said. "Well, it's more that we're dealing with all of the reinforcements that haven't figured out they've been beaten yet. You think you're finally done and then another battalion shows up. What about the gazers? They haven't shown their ugly faces yet. Long-range patrols haven't detected any approaches, so they're still probably making themselves cozy in the rest of Kazana." "I still don't know what these gazers are," Florine said. "Floating eyeballs with teeth," the officer said. "We probably won't see any for a while, though. They'll send their slave armies first." "Why is it that everyone down here seems to have a slave army?" "How large is this invasion?" Florine asked. "Large enough to overrun the rest of Kazana," the officer answered. "Gazers don't raise proper slaves like we do, though. They're basically battle fodder with little to no formal training." "Is that truly enough to overrun Kazana?" "It depends on what they've got fighting for them. A bunch of monsters, dragons, and other nasties would make a mess out of a principality while a good chunk of the army's away. If they didn't have those, then it'd have to be a pretty big hive with multiple spawners." Since they could enslave dragons, gazers sounded like a powerful species. Maybe they were as strong as frost giants. With that in mind, the absurdly large army that the council had mustered no longer seemed so absurd. The crowds thinned out as they ascended until only their escort accompanied them up the underway. When the hard, angular dark dwarven architecture grew monolithic in proportions, more dwarves appeared in the buildings around them. Their escort stopped in what appeared to be a huge courtyard penned in on all sides by massive fortifications built into the cavern walls. "Have we arrived?" Florine asked. "Yeah, this is it," Velgarth answered with a gesture toward the far end of the courtyard. "The Gate of Harder." Florine's gaze went in the direction of the dwarf woman's gesture, but she didn't see anything that resembled a gate. There was a space that indicated that something was probably there, but the dark lamps illuminating the area only revealed the same stone formations that made up the rest of the cavern wall. "I should have asked Isaraku what he saw when he came here last." Possibly the greatest hazard of the realms below was the magical interference that came from being so deep underground. All sorts of tier magic spells did not work over long distances, including message, teleportation, and long-range divination school spells. As this was the case, Isaraku had to travel to the surface to submit Prince Fama's second order for undead security forces. Just as she was starting to feel that Velgarth was making fun of her again, a soldier stepped out of the cavern wall. There was no sign of a door or even any magical effect. She had simply walked out of the stone as if it wasn't there. The soldier went over to the captain of their escort, and they spoke in low voices for a few moments before the captain turned to address Florine and her party. "Time to get some obnoxiously fresh air," he said. "Follow me." The captain strode forward and disappeared into the stone. Florine stopped at the threshold, pressing her hand to the cool stone of the cavern wall. It didn't pass through, so it either wasn't an illusion or it was an illusion so powerful that she was being tricked into believing there was a real wall in front of her. "What are you doing?" Velgarth's voice came from behind her. "My hand isn't going through," Florine replied. "It's not supposed to go through," Velgarth said. "You're supposed to go through." "Wah!" A hand pressed against the small of her back and shoved her roughly into the wall. Florine's shriek was swallowed by the stone. The end of it sounded through the cool night air outside and echoed off of the nearby cliffs. She cringed as dozens of heads turned toward her. What just happened? She was pushed into a wall and popped out of a mountain somewhere. A forest of tall conifers obscured the scenery aside from the tops of the sheer peaks surrounding their location. Above her, the moon and stars peeked out from behind the intermittent cloud cover. "Well, go ahead and do your thing," Velgarth said. "We'll be waiting here." Florine wasn't actually sure what she was supposed to be doing. In the end, she followed Isaraku out into the forest, where they stopped after walking for 5 minutes. The Elder Lich raised a hand to the side of its head. A few seconds later, the portal of a gate spell opened nearby and someone completely unexpected appeared. Lady Negredo, Florine lowered her head in a curtsy. This is a pleasant surprise. Baroness Gagne, Lady Negredo returned her greeting. It's good to see you alive and well. Was there some cause for concern? It's just that keeping track of things underground is troublesome. The information from the Azalesian mountain dwarves also indicated that things grow more dangerous the deeper one gets, and we had no idea where you disappeared to after entering that ruined city under the Abelian hills. I see, Florine said. Well, as you can see, my lady, I'm still in one piece. We had a few interesting encounters, though. Speaking of which, did we do anything about that hill dwarf city or its surroundings? Not yet, Lady Nigdo replied. Exploring ruins like that is supposed to be the task of the Adventurer Guild. We've left sentries at the entrance until they get around to it. Florine nodded, sighing internally with relief. She couldn't imagine the undead handling the complicated situation of the realms below very well. Given what had happened when they traveled through the area, employing the undead for exploration would make things harder for the Sorceress Kingdom in various ways. It was a good thing that the Sorcerer King had the foresight to address the issue far in advance. Columns of undead exited the gate, arranging themselves between the trees. Falagram's order came close to matching the Draconic Kingdom's current lease, so Florine was sure that the administration was ecstatic about it. By the way, Florine said, what are you doing here, my lady? My dear little sister sent me to investigate the entrance of Carsonar, Lady Negredo replied. Its existence has caused quite the stir. How so? Lady Negredo gestured toward Isoroku. When this child submitted the order for undead security forces earlier today, my little sister asked me to observe the location where its message was sent from. I was surprised to find that I couldn't. You couldn't find where Isoroku was? No, Lady Negredo shook her head. I couldn't find the location. It's as if this place doesn't exist. Or perhaps its existence is transient. I've never seen anything like it before. What about where we're standing now? Florine asked. We're encountering the same issue, Lady Negredo answered. I know that I'm somewhere, but I'm not sure where it is. Attempts at divination by our people back in the Sorceress Kingdom simply fail to produce any results. The only thing that appears to work is the gate spell, though that was expected. I'm sorry, my lady, but I'm not very well versed in magic. The best way to put it is that it's a matter of targeting. Unlike most teleportation-type spells, which require either direct line of sight or familiarity with the target location, gate opens a portal to wherever the caster wants it to open. For instance, if someone went to the other side of the world and requested a gate via message, the caster of the spell need only open a gate to the person. They don't need to be familiar with the person's location or even know where the person is. I suppose not all magic is made equal, Florine said. Certainly not, Lady Negredo laughed lightly. Beyond that, magic is not a mere exercise of strength. There are first-tier spells that can foil 10th-tier spells, and the locals in the region have come up with many novel ways to employ what magic they have. She had heard something like that, though it was part of a conversation between Lady Shultier and Ludmilla some time ago. Magic had rules, and all spells had to obey those rules unless they were specifically made to break or circumvent them in some way. In that case, Florine said, I shouldn't take up any more of your time. The entrance is this way, my lady. 15 minutes later, they were still walking around the forest with no sign of the Carsonar entrance. That's strange, Florine said. We didn't walk that far. I could even see where we came from and we headed straight there. I don't detect any magic being used at all, Lady Negredo said. This is quite intriguing. I never realized my sense of direction was that terrible. Florine looked down in embarrassment. It's probably not you, Lady Negredo told her. This location is probably under some form of defensive enchantment. But you said you didn't detect any magic being used at all? Well, it wouldn't be much of a defensive enchantment if people could casually detect it. Its design is quite clever. Something is subtly keeping us from reaching the destination, and it's also preventing long-range observation. At the same time, those under the effect of the enchantment have no sense of being under one. If we didn't know that something was supposed to be around here, we would have probably walked through the area without noticing anything amiss. Can magic do that? To most, magic was healing spells and fireballs. The most common applications were practical and straightforward, such as providing a convenient water source, preserving food, or stamping official documents. When one brought to mind the most powerful magical thing they could think of, it was usually some legendary sword or magic item. What was going on around Hardergate was mythological in its mystique. It was no wonder that no one could ever figure out where the dark dwarves came from. "What in the world are you two doing?" Lady Albedo trumped out of the trees behind them. Florine sent a glance over the Prime Minister's figure, which was not adorned in its usual alabaster garb, but a suit of black plate mail. In her right hand was a massive black bardiche that she seemed to handle with no less difficulty than a pen. Florine lowered her head and waited for Lady Negredo to reply, but she seemed engrossed in trying to uncover the secrets of Hardergate. "I was leading Lady Negredo to the entrance," Florine said, "but we're unable to get there." "It's quite amazing, dear sister," Lady Negredo spoke up excitedly. "Try flying up and see what happens." The Prime Minister of the Sorceress Kingdom, currently demoted to dear sister, shot up through the trees with a powerful flap of her wings. However, she didn't come back down. A few minutes later, she came tromping through the trees again. "Those cheeky dwarves," Lady Albedo muttered darkly as her free hand went to the scepter at her waist. "I should give the ground a good whack for their impertinence." Lady Negredo came up, waving her hands in front of her in a panic. "You shouldn't cause trouble for others, dear sister," she said. "Besides, this is far more valuable intact, don't you think? Can you replicate the effect?" I can't say for certain without more study, but we may be able to develop a similar effect with the right people. This sort of thing wouldn't ever be allowed by Ariadne, so I don't think we've considered it." The Prime Minister put on a thoughtful look. "You're right about that," she said. "Perhaps it could be used in the area around Nazarick. There are places throughout the Sorceress Kingdom that could use more security, as well." "What happened when you flew above the trees?" Lady Negredo asked. "I left the area, for lack of a better way to put it. I went straight up, and when I tried landing by going straight back down, I ended up somewhere else." "So magic resistance isn't a factor," Lady Negredo crossed her arms. "It's doubtful that anything these dwarves could devise would work on me if it did." "A field effect, then? If so, it's less like the castable ones and more like an environmental setting. How far did you have to fly to get back to us?" As the conversation went on to become a snarl of unknown terms, Florine wondered if her review with Lady Albedo would ever happen. Or if they would ever make it back to Carsonar. "You people ready yet?" Velgarth appeared from behind a tree and walked over to stand beside Florine. "Yes," Florine replied. "We tried returning on our own, but we couldn't for some reason." "That's what's supposed to happen," Velgarth told her. "Who are those two women wandering off down there?" "The one in black armor is Lady Albedo, the Prime Minister of the Sorceress Kingdom. The one walking with her is Lady Negredo, her older sister. Oh, I'd like to tell you that you should behave yourself around Lady Albedo. She's a demon," Velgarth said. "A creature of chaos and destruction. I'm surprised you're working under someone like that considering how you feel about Yaldabaoth." "Lady Albedo is an entirely reasonable person," Florine told the dwarf. "Also, we don't have anyone like Yaldabaoth in the Sorcerer's Kingdom." "I'll take your word for it, but what's she doing here?" "She wanted to see me about something," Florine replied. "I hope you don't mind if we stay out here for a while longer." While one might think to offer their hospitality as one would to an important guest, the Prime Minister of a country going into another without authorization or proper arrangements was completely out of the question. Then again, the thought might have never crossed the Dark Dwarf's mind at all given how they were. "Can we at least get the undead moving along?" Velgarth said. "That shouldn't be a problem." Velgarth walked over to where Isoroku was checking to make sure Prince Feelhammer's order had been accurately delivered. It was only then that Florine realized that, in all that time trying to reach Carsonar, they somehow hadn't moved very far at all. "Did you see where she came from?" Lady Negredo asked when she returned with her sister. "I didn't," Florine shook her head. "Lady Velgarth is some sort of psionic assassin and she's very good at not being noticed when she doesn't want to be. So it seems that our suspicions about the Dark Dwarves were true." Lady Albedo eyed Velgarth as she went by with the undead column. "Negredo, please accompany them to the entrance." "Of course, dear sister." Once Velgarth and Negredo vanished from view, Albedo turned her attention to Florine. I hope Lady Negredo doesn't mind Velgarth's personality, Florine said. As a whole, dark dwarves are. We're aware, Lady Albedo said. It seems that dark dwarves really are dark dwarves. What does that mean, my lady? It means that the majority of their race can be relied upon to be a certain way, no matter where they come from. Don't tell me you haven't noticed this in your time working as an official. I don't have any expectations of anyone being a certain way, Florine replied. Humans certainly aren't like that. Oh, but they are. Lady Albedo's bardiche vanished as she crossed her arms. It's just that their job classes influence them as much as their race does, which makes you think that humans certainly aren't like that. Was that the case? One's vocation certainly affected one's perspective and thus their behavior, but Florine always thought of it as a normal thing. Are you saying that the dark dwarves have racial class levels? No, Lady Albedo told her. They're humanoids. They just happen to live in environments where their natural tendencies allow them to thrive as they are. Just like humans. The Prime Minister's glowing amber gaze looked down on Florine as if she were a bug. She sometimes got like that, particularly when the topic of humans was brought up. There were rumors that she had been heard referring to them as lower life forms in the past. I will keep that in mind when I observe the behavior of others, my lady, Florine said. Isoroku mentioned that you wanted to conduct a review with me. Is there something that you wish to speak about in particular? Not in particular, Lady Albedo said. I simply desire information. The time between your entry into the dwarf ruins under the Abelian Hills to today has been a complete blank since we've been unable to communicate with the Elder Liches. You may begin with what you've learned with the Dark Dwarf nation's military and political situation. Even summarizing what she knew, it took an hour for Florine to convey what she had seen. Lady Albedo didn't seem to mind at all, stopping Florine once in a while to clarify or expand on certain points. I've also begun putting together my thoughts on what I've seen of Dark Dwarven society so far, Florine said. In particular, I've come across notable cases confirming what we've come to learn about job class development and how various methods may be employed to nurture growth. Oh? I'd like to see it if you feel it's in a presentable state. It's not presentable, but it does contain the key points I wish to convey if you don't mind the clutter. Lady Albedo held out a gauntleted hand. Florine reached into her infinite haversack, producing the notes that she had been working on throughout the day. The Prime Minister flipped through them at the startling speed that she usually did. Early on, many nobles suspected that she didn't read their reports at all, but they were quickly proven wrong. This is quite useful, Lady Albedo said as she handed back the stack of papers. I assume you're not proposing a system of slavery. Of course not, my lady, Florine replied. Their system simply confirms what we know and the report offers a case study on how they have applied their take on the class system to their society. In fact, with a bit of effort, I believe we can far surpass their system with our own. She would need to consult with Clara and Director Alpha about that to make sure she was on the right track. Neither of them would probably be pleased about how she came across the information, however. In that case, Lady Albedo said, I look forward to your proposals in the future. I believe there's something else you've wanted to say this entire time? Silence fell over the forest as Florine looked up at Lady Albedo's expectant expression. She was already sure what the answer to her concerns would be, but she dreaded asking all the same. Prince Feelhammer may be following the terms of his lease to the letter, Florine said, but he's not doing as much as he could be to aid his people. I understand that, as a country, we can't be seen as some sort of regional nanny that comes to the rescue of everyone regardless of why they were in trouble in the first place, but the lives of tens of millions are at stake. I will answer your concerns with a question of my own, Baroness Gonye. Lady Albedo placed a hand on her hip. Do you see any political repercussions in letting events play out as they appear to be? No, my lady, Florine sighed. From a purely political perspective, the way things appear to be going will only end in a net positive for the Sorcerer's Kingdom. At least as far as I can see. So there you have it, the bardiche returned to Lady Albedo's hand. That is not a conclusion I could have come up with on my own, by the way. Not in the same way you have, at any rate. Remember that you occupy your current position precisely because your capabilities in this particular arena are unparalleled in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. There is no need to second-guess yourself. With that, Lady Albedo flew off, leaving Florine with a sense of tired resignation. She had known it all along, but the confirmation left her with a deep sense of dissatisfaction. To achieve its foreign policy objectives, the Sorceress Kingdom saw the deaths of countless millions as no obstacle. Your definition of a while longer is a lot different from mine. I'm sorry, Florian said. The meeting was a bit impromptu. I didn't know how long it would take, but I didn't think it would take that long. Their progress through Harder slowed as the crowds grew, even with a column of undead leading the way. Or perhaps it was because of them. The underway was only so wide, after all. How much will the undead help with the situation in Harder? Florian asked. I'm sure everyone up here would like to return to their homes. According to that contract of yours, Velgarth said, they can only be used to defend. The ones deployed here will be used to hold key positions while our forces go on the offensive. Not that these Death Knights are so great at getting around anyway. I thought that problems with mobility would be solved by having rangers guide them. That doesn't exactly work when you're fighting, Velgarth told her. Also, half of the problem is that they're too big to fit in a lot of passages. Elder Liches using certain summons are more effective in most operations down here. She couldn't say that she had heard of that problem before. It seemed that there could be problems using Death Series servitors wherever one was. At least the Dark Dwarves didn't attempt to use those reasons to bargain down the lease rates. A goblin hawker somehow managed to get close to them with a wide platter balanced on her head. Florian examined the skewers of roasted mushrooms arrayed upon it before picking out a colorful-looking selection. Would you like one, Velgarth? Not hungry. The goblin wrinkled its nose at the coins Florian dropped in her palm before shrugging and walking off. Florian made a mental note to get her hands on some of the local currency. It was something that merchants usually made a point of doing as they went from place to place, but the new experiences had been so overwhelming that it had slipped her mind. Does Fjellhammer have a merchant guild branch? Florian asked. Yeah. Will they establish ties with the merchant guild on the surface now that you're going to conduct trade with the Sorceress Kingdom and its allies? You'd have to ask the prince about that. Well, probably not. Why? They're fine for enforcing industrial standards and managing their members, Velgarth said, but you can't let them get too powerful. Otherwise, they'll start doing things that they shouldn't be doing. Such as? Like trying to change laws to work in their favor or even getting into politics. Is there something wrong with that? Of course there is. Velgarth gave her a funny look. Having a merchant in a position of power is a sure way to run a country off of a cliff. All they think about is trade, profits, and expanding economic influence. I know more than a few people that would readily equate running a country to running a business, Florian said. Velgarth let out a derisive snort. Probably because they're merchants. Governance and commerce are two entirely different things. Just because both happen to manage resources doesn't make them similar. The goal of a business is to make a profit. The goal of a government is to run a country, city, or whatever. If you have merchants sticking their heads where they don't belong, it's a clear sign that you need to cut them off. But I'm a merchant. Florian nibbled dejectedly on her skewer. She didn't think she was that terrible at managing her domain. Or maybe she was, and that was why her friends were all getting promoted ahead of her. Clara and Leanne were merchants as well, but was there something fundamentally different about what they did that she hadn't noticed? Aren't you worried about being poisoned? Velgarth looked pointedly at her skewer. I'm immune to poison, Florian answered. Why would anyone want to poison me, anyway? Are you seriously saying that? Velgarth frowned at her. You're a foreign dignitary. The most efficient way for the council to get back at Clan Fjellhammer is to... Something struck Florian in the chest. It tumbled in the air countless times before landing on the stone floor with a metallic clatter. She turned at a light thudding sound, finding a dark object sticking out of the vampire bride. Shouts rose around them as the captain of her escort barked out orders. Several Death Knights closed around her, locking their shields together. Be right back, Velgarth said before vanishing into the crowd. The vampire bride yanked the object out of her abdomen. It was a steel quarrel roughly the length of her forearm. She held out the projectile to Isoroku, who took it in its bony fingers. Appraise all magic item. Isoroku examined the spent missile for a moment before stuffing it into its inventory. Is there anything special about it? Florian asked. No. Florian looked out in the direction that the quarrel came from. The shields of the Death Knights blocked her view, but she would have probably only seen darkness anyway. Aside from the time that Leon had thrown a rock at her out of curiosity, it was the first time she had been purposely attacked. But what was the point of doing so? It wasn't as if she was some powerful individual or presented a threat to anyone. Velgarth returned 5 minutes later. She peered up at Florine suspiciously before reaching out and squeezing her left breast. Florine let out a cry, jumping back and crossing her arms defensively in front of herself. Velgarth, however, only looked down at her empty hand, working her fingers as if analyzing the sensation. As I was saying, the dwarf woman turned and resumed walking. The most efficient way for the council to get back at Clan Fielhammer is to stir up trouble between us and the Sorceress Kingdom. And the easiest way to do that is to kill you. It's a good sign, I guess. How could it possibly be a good sign? Because it means the councils realize that they can't win. The force is still in Harder, and any leftovers that join them will be switching from trying to retake Harder to conducting what covert operations they can. Since you're immune to assassinations or something, mind walking around Harder all alone? It'd speed things up immensely. No, thank you. But didn't you want to take a look around? Velgarth tilted her head curiously. Please take me back to Fielhammer Citadel. Suit yourself. They wasted no time boarding the train once it arrived at the station. Florine hugged herself, trembling as she sat alone on her cold steel seat. Someone tried to kill me. She had been in plenty of potentially dangerous situations before, but this was the first time that anyone had targeted her specifically. The fact that she didn't even know who it was or what they looked like only made it worse. She was confident that she could de-escalate any situation with her abilities, but those abilities relied on being able to communicate with her attacker. As it was, all she could do was hide and pray that they couldn't get to her. As they crossed Harder Bridge, slices of orange light illuminated the interior of the armored car through the arrow slits on one side. Florine was pressed back against her hard seat as the train accelerated and the guards leveled their crossbows. Across from her, Velgarth leaned forward slightly to peer out of one of the arrow slits. What was that? Florine asked nervously. Gazer scouts, probably, Velgarth answered. Something just got blasted out of the air. Another flash of orange light flared angrily into their rail car. Florine shifted away from the wall. Gazers can fly? They sure can, Velgarth said. Just don't ask me how. Why? The dark dwarf gave her a long look. Because they don't have wings or anything like that, they sort of just float. You heard the captain, didn't you? They're basically eyes with teeth. No matter how she thought about the description, Florine could only imagine something silly. Another explosion lit the darkness before they crossed over into Fielhammer. The streets that were so busy when they departed from Harder were already emptied of people. When they arrived at the base of the citadel, she found the stronghold's defenses fully manned and its floodlights sent blue-white beams into the air around it. When she arrived at Fielhammer Citadel, Leolio flew down from the main gate to alight upon her head. Florine reached up to take him in her hands and hugged him to her breast. I should have taken him with me. Florine didn't know why, but she felt safer with him around. She couldn't attend a meeting with Lady Albedo with a demi-human sitting on her head, however, so she had the Myku stay behind with Boobibi and Fielhammer. It had taken her a while to convince Leolio that he wasn't being abandoned, and his hurt and anxious protests twisted at her heart as she did so. Pip. In response, Florine hugged him more tightly to herself. Velgarth shook her head. It's not as if you were hurt. I don't come from a place where assassinations are an everyday thing. But they happen at least sometimes, right? I bet you know a few assassins yourself. I do, but, arg. Why do you have to make it sound that way? Sound what way? Velgarth looked up innocently at Florine's glower. Generally speaking, it wasn't a good thing to be associated with assassins, but Tyra and the other members of Ijarnir that she had become acquainted with weren't terrible people. They went straight to the Great Hall to confirm the delivery of the undead security forces. Thankfully, all of the torture was over and Florine made her way to the throne without any nightmarish scenes to accompany her. The prince looked up as she approached, tossing the pile of papers in his hand onto the table to his right. If I didn't know any better, he said, I'd have thought you timed everything to your advantage. We saw what happened over Harder Bridge, Florine said. Is Fielhammer under attack? No, Prince Fielhammer said, but we are being scouted. Since the bridges to Darksteel and Grimmantle have been destroyed, They have no direct way to send the bulk of their army after us. Our task now is to keep them blind until we can confirm a few things. With the Elder Liches incorporated into our air defenses, it shouldn't be a problem." The prince's relaxed manner only served to disgust her. It was said, often with a healthy dose of cynicism, that one hand washed the other, but she never imagined that anyone would use the blood of so many to do so. Out of curiosity, Florian asked, "What is the population of a single principality?" Upward to 500,000 dark dwarves. Around 3 million slaves, if that matters. Tens of millions were being sacrificed for Prince Feelhammer's ambitions facilitated by the Sorceress Kingdom. As the Sorceress Kingdom's official representative, all she could do was stand silently by while it happened. As a cold, political calculation, she couldn't dispute whether it was worth it or not. That the Sorceress Kingdom would suffer any damage to its reputation at all was even in question. They were dealing with a power that barely anyone on the surface knew of and none had official relations with, as far as they could tell. Even if the events that transpired were brought to light, it could be claimed that it was a civil conflict outside of the Sorceress Kingdom's jurisdiction. She doubted that anyone would openly question that statement, as doing so would suggest that the Sorceress Kingdom should start intervening in everyone's affairs, whether they liked it or not. It was as neat a package as they could obtain, an opportunity to use their abundant martial strength for pure political and economic gain. "If there are so many people in Kazana," Florian said, "then how strong are the forces attacking it?" "Aside from notably strong individuals and monsters," Prince Feelhammer replied, "they shouldn't be much more powerful than Kazana's forces. At least if the council hadn't flung a good portion of it at us. Even if they've been slacking with keeping the nearby areas of the Middle Realms clear, it should have taken a good while for the Gazers to dream up sufficient forces to attack them." Florian blinked slowly as she attempted to digest the statement. "I'm not sure if it's a translation problem, but did you just say dream up? As in the thing you do when you sleep?" "Yeah." "Then I'm afraid that I don't follow." "That's their primary mode of reproduction," Prince Feelhammer told her. "As a general rule, Gazers are xenophobic, paranoid, egotistical, megalomaniacal, and narcissistic. And all of that goes to extremes that are beyond the imagination of most. It's to the point that, when a Gazer has a dream about themselves, they'll wake up with a copy of themselves waking up beside them. So they think so highly of themselves that the world bends to facilitate their ego? Something like that. It only becomes a problem when a powerful Gazer dreams up a bunch of copies of itself without them all killing one another for being imposters." "How powerful do they get?" Florian asked. "I haven't fought many personally," Prince Feelhammer answered, "but the records state that they can be as strong or even stronger than ancient dragons. I assume that we don't have anything too powerful on our hands or they'd have already flown over to destroy us. The fact that they're sending scouts means that the forces they encountered defending Kazana were enough to make the Gazers cautious in their advance. If it was anyone else, Florian might have thought them possessed of an attractive degree of stoic confidence. Dark dwarfs as a whole seemed to have a poor opinion of everything, however, so there was very little that was enjoyable about her interactions with them." An officer entered the great hall, walking around Florian to deliver his report. "My prince," he said, "we're up to 200 Gazer scouts in the past hour. Nothing major, so far. The undead have started arriving at their posts and we're familiarizing them with our defenses." "Any sign of their army?" Prince Feelhammer asked. "Our patrols continue uninterrupted," the officer answered. "We're still dealing with council remnants in Harder, but they've started getting scarce. It'll take a good while to root out the ones that have blended in with the local population." An unsettling feeling returned as Florian was reminded of the recent assassination attempt against her. She excused herself as more officers filtered in to make their reports and confer with the prince. Back in her stateroom, she lay down on her bed, holding her wrist over her forehead. Boobibi came out from the odd little tunnel she had made out of a combination of dwarven furniture and their baggage. As with Leolio, Florian had convinced her to stay behind while she met with Lady Albedo. "What happened?" Boobibi asked. "Someone tried to kill me," Florian answered with a sigh. The Xian hero came over, examining Florian with her eyeless gaze. "Are you injured? I knew I should have insisted on accompanying you. This dark dwarf hive is nowhere near as safe as Xian ones." "I wasn't hurt," Florian said, "I'm just feeling a bit unsettled. No one's ever tried to kill me before." Boobibi regarded Florine, her antennae and barbed arms moving in an uncertain gesture. "I'm afraid I can't understand your position," Boobibi told her. "I was born as a soldier, so that sort of thing is expected. More than expected, there is a certain sense of fulfillment when I am fighting for the hive and someone is trying to kill me." Florine rested her hands lightly upon Leolio, who was sitting on her stomach. Though an attempted assassination wasn't an experience that she wanted to share, it served to demonstrate how difficult it could be to develop a rapport with other races. One couldn't assume a similar sense of empathy as one could with members of their own species. What was traumatic for one might be uplifting for another. How multiracial societies came up with a common culture shared between all of its member species without tending toward abusive relationships was beyond her. The need for collective survival probably only worked up to a certain point, and simply saying "oh, they're just like that" felt insipid at best. She shifted a bit on her hard stone mattress before sitting up with an annoyed sound. Leolio fluttered to a chair nearby. Why did dark dwarves insist on tormenting everyone, even themselves? She reached into her infinite haversack and pulled out a thick blanket, laying it over the stone. Then, she pulled out another one. "What are you doing?" Boobibi asked. "Distracting myself," Florine grumbled. "If you'd like something soft on your bed," the vampire bride came forward with a smile, "I would be more than happy to." "No." Florine turned her glare on Isoroku. "Is something the matter?" the elder lich said. "It's nothing." For some reason, she was mad that it didn't have anything to say. "Leolio is hungry." "I'll take it." Florine picked up Leolio and she walked out of her stateroom with an excuse to do something firmly in hand. Normally, a member of the host staff would see to every need of a foreign dignitary, but hospitality was not a strong point for dark dwarves. One of the guards at the door merely grunted as she went by. "Where do they even eat? Has anyone eaten recently?" "No," Leolio said. "No," said Boobibi. "No," the vampire bride chimed in. She supposed that she had been negligent when it came to her staff. The last time they had eaten anything together was before Prince Feelhammer launched the campaign to reclaim his territory. They wandered up and down the citadel's corridors, searching for something like a dining area, but not even the aroma of food could be detected. After recalling the stone-splitting loaf of dwarven bread, Florine sighed. "Summon my escort," she told Isoroku. "We're going out." The guards at the main gate stopped them to ask where they were going. Once Florine answered them, they had them wait until Velgarth appeared with a grumpy look. "You had to do this now?" "If you were busy with something," Florine replied, "you don't have to come." "That's not how it works. The prince told me to attend to you." "I'm sorry. I'm still just upset over everything that happened." "I see. So you're the sort that does things when they get mad. Maybe you're more like us than I thought." Orange explosions blossomed in the distance as they descended to the city using the citadel's main lift. There were so many now that there wasn't a moment when some part of the darkness wasn't bathed in fiery light. "Can this really be called scouting anymore?" Florine said. "You just have to consider the scale of everything," Velgarth told her. "If they had enough to overrun the rest of Kazanah, even losing thousands by the hour barely scratches their numbers. What do they hope to accomplish by doing this? Probing our defenses for weak spots, expending our resources and trying to wear down our soldiers. But that won't work anymore now that we have the undead in place. We're already baiting them into making their first big move by giving them what they're looking for." She looked out to the field of fleeting stars, but she couldn't see what Velgarth was talking about. Maybe someone like Ludmilla would have recognized it. Unlike the area around Harder Bridge, the surface level below the citadel was still moderately active. Velgarth led them past it all to an access ramp to the areas below. A wave of heat assailed them as they entered the crowded passageways in search of a meal. "People look strangely unconcerned here," Florine said. "It's as if a war isn't on the verge of breaking out." "How would that help with anything?" Velgarth asked. "Don't they think of helping out somehow or even escaping to safety?" "They help by working," Velgarth told her. "If for some reason you think that they'd be of any help personally joining the fight, I'll have you know that even a novice dwarf warrior can kill hundreds of production slaves. They'll just get in the way if you throw them in the mix. Actually, shouldn't it be the same way with you?" "What do you mean?" "You don't do anything silly like using farmers as soldiers or something, do you?" It took all of 3 seconds of silence for Velgarth to let out a disgusted sound. Every country handles their security differently, Florine said. Riestais does as you say, levying manpower for their armies when needed. Roble requires mandatory military service from all of their citizens, regardless of gender. In theory, at least. Baharuth and Slain have professional standing armies, as does the Draconic Kingdom. Oh, Carnessus uses a levy system like Riestais, but I suppose with the majority of their population being demi-humans, there's a notable difference in strength. And what about the Sorceress Kingdom? We have a professional army, Florine replied. Normal people obviously can't match the Death Series servitors in what they excel at, but we do have auxiliary forces that support them. Did she dodge yet another barrage of Velgarth's disdain? Hopefully, she would leave it at that. Is this fine? Florine followed the line of Velgarth's gaze. I've heard of hole-in-the-wall establishments, but this one takes it quite literally. A row of stone stools was placed in front of a stone counter that was carved out of an alcove in the passage. A bored-looking ogre stood in a rectangular opening in the wall. I can't say that I'm not at least a bit curious. They entered the alcove and took their seats. The ogre looked down from the window with a dull expression. How do we order? Florine whispered. Just say what you want, Velgarth replied. She's not going to recognize any cuisine from the surface, obviously. What would everyone like? Mammal meat, Boobibi said. Grubs. Leolia pipped. Virgin blood, please, the vampire bride said. The ogre looked at Florine. Oh, Florine said. I've already eaten. I'm good, Velgarth said. Florine half rose out of her seat, trying to see what the ogre was doing. She hadn't questioned any part of the order, not even the virgin blood. I don't see any dwarf staff in there, Florine noted. Huh? Velgarth frowned. Why would there be a dwarf here? This is a dining establishment, isn't it? I thought dark dwarves owned everything in Kazana. They do, but we don't usually eat the same thing. This is actually the back window of a slave dormitory. They're running this side thing to make a little extra. The slaves, or their masters? Both? The masters profit off of the establishment and the slaves working here get a bit ahead of their fellow slaves by getting better at what they do. The first dish to arrive was a whole bat that landed in front of Boobibi with a light thump. Florine stared at the thing. It was as large as Boobibi was. Then she turned her gaze away as Boobibi opened her frighteningly disturbing mouth and started working on her meal. Did they even prepare that in any way? How does that help them get any better as cooks? Florine jumped as a slab of maggot-infested meat landed on the counter in front of her with a splat. Leolio hopped off of her head and pecked away at it with a relish. Florine turned her head away again, trying not to get sick. Finally, the ogre gently set a polished stone bowl in front of the vampire bride. Florine wasn't sure what to think of herself as she watched the vampire bride take a sip of blood without any sense of queasiness. How is it? Florine asked. It's not bad, the vampire bride said. I'm surprised they could provide virgin blood. Baby, the ogre said proudly. That makes sense, the vampire bride nodded sagely. Florine leaned forward, covering her face in her hands. Are you all right, my lady? The vampire bride asked. No, Florine answered. She settled on watching the passing crowds as her companions worked on their meals, considering the realities of running a multiracial restaurant. Though the preparation could appear questionable, the residents of Erantal's demi-human quarter all appeared to eat at least somewhat normal-looking things. As more and more non-humans populated the Sorceress Kingdom, however, more exotic establishments would surely show up. A beast man dining on raw steak was one thing, but could a human enjoy a meal while the demi-human sitting across the table from them was happily shoving fistfuls of writhing maggots into their mouths? Probably not. Thus far, she had worked hard to make things as inclusive as possible for the Sorceress Kingdom's citizens, but segregation of dining establishments by diet and feeding habits was probably inevitable. We need to hurry it up, Velgarth said after a few minutes. Florine looked around for potential dangers in the crowd. Is something going on? She asked. My father just contacted me, Velgarth answered. War's starting.